Welcome, wanderer, to another gentle journey into the past. This is Historian Couch, your narrator for the night. Before we begin, tell me quietly in the comments, what time is it where you are? Is it late at night, just past midnight, or early morning, when the birds are just beginning to stir? Wherever you are, and whenever you are, you've come to the right place. So plug in your earphones. Keep the distractions far, far away. Nestle under your blankets and allow your body to rest. Tonight, I'll take you somewhere old, somewhere silent, through stone walls and winding staircases, past the flickering torches, to a time when castles weren't fairy tales. They were cold, cruel, and often deadly. This is not a dramatic tale. There are no sudden moments here. Only the slow, steady breath of history, told in hushed tones. This is your time to slow down. This is your time to listen. Let's begin. In the heart of the old world stood a structure both enduring and unmoving. The Stone Keep. It loomed above the treetops and valleys like a monument, not just to protection, but to permanence. Built layer by layer, stone by weathered stone, it was less a house and more a fortress, a shelter carved against both time and invasion. Within its towering walls, life did not flourish so much as endure. Inside, silence moved before people did. The air, when undisturbed, was still and cool, colder even in summer, and icy in winter. The thick stone held temperature with stubborn persistence. Fire could not warm it fully. Even the largest hearths did little more than soften the edge of the chill, their smoke curling upward into rafters stained black with time. Each morning began not with sunshine, but with shadows. Light reached the keep reluctantly. Through the arrow slits and tiny glassless windows, only narrow shafts of pale daylight crept in, enough to see shapes, to sense movement, to know one was not entirely alone. But there was no brilliance. Only a grayish, filtered glow, as though the sun itself had to ask permission to enter. The walls were rough and unyielding. They smelled of damp earth and old iron. Moss sometimes grew between the stones in the lower chambers, and the scent of cold stone mixed with the faint bitterness of wood smoke and tallow. Even silence had a texture here, not empty, but weighted. It pressed gently against the skin, like the breath of a cave. Footsteps did not echo loudly. Instead, they whispered. Cloth slippers brushed over flagstone. Iron-buckled boots clacked softly, softened by centuries of smoothing. Every hall, every corridor, was a passage, not just through space, but through time. The keep was never still for long. Servants stirred before the sky paled, moving through shadowed halls with flickering rush torches in hand. They spoke seldom. They did not need to. Their duties had been etched into routine, passed down like prayers. One servant might carry firewood from the stores below, stacking logs neatly near the great hearth in the main hall. Another might bring water, drawn by hand from the castle well, the wooden bucket dripping as it swung gently from its iron handle. Water was never wasted. Every drop hauled was earned. The walls of the inner chambers were not plastered, but bare, cold stone, heavy and damp. Tapestries hung only in rooms of importance, not for decoration, but insulation. Their thick fabric helped to trap heat and hush sound. The images woven into them told of battles long past, saints with hollow eyes, and noble faces now forgotten. Rooms were sparse. A single bed of rough wood, straw-stuffed mattress, and thick woolen blankets. The floor was bare except for rushes, old reeds scattered and mixed with herbs to disguise smells. Lavender, rosemary, and mint softened the air, but never fully erased the mustiness. Above, the narrow wooden beams groaned softly under age. Dust hung in still air. Mice somewhere in the dark made tiny feet known. But the inhabitants grew used to it. This was not a place to notice discomfort. It was a place to survive it. In the keep, day and night were marked not by clocks, but by bells. The chapel bell rang at lauds, matins, terce, sext, ancient hours with ancient names. Each toll was a breath in the long rhythm of the day. It told the cook when to begin kneading dough, the steward when to review stores, the guard when to patrol, and the priest when to pray. These sounds became more familiar than voices. Heat, when it came, was fleeting. Only the kitchen, low, smoky, and always alive, carried any warmth. The fire in the cooking hearth was rarely extinguished, but its warmth did not travel far. The stone drank it up before it could wander. People wore layers, linen next to skin, then wool, then fur if they were lucky. Even then, fingers remained red and numb in colder months. Breath clouded in bedrooms as easily as it did outside. And so the keep remained, cold, still, quiet, but it was not lifeless. It was full of purpose, repetition, discipline. Everything served something larger, the preservation of life, of lineage, of legacy. The cold was not a flaw. It was the cost of protection. The darkness, not a failure, merely the absence of threat. For those within, the keep was home. Uncomfortable, yes. Inhospitable, often, but known, predictable, anchored. A place where generations lived and died and left behind nothing but echoes in stone. Mid-morning came slowly in the keep. The sun, even when bright, could not find easy entry. It slid across the outer towers, brushed the mossy stones, and cast light onto parapets and narrow windows. But little of that warmth ever touched the rooms within. Inside, the hours passed with quiet repetition. In the main hall, where stone columns rose toward a shadowed ceiling of oak beams, the atmosphere remained dim and chilled. A fire might burn in the hearth, but its heat rarely stretched beyond a few paces. Those seated near it shifted often, holding hands close to the flames before returning them to their cloaks or wool sleeves. The great hall was a room of many purposes, but little comfort. Meals were taken there, often silently, except for the clink of wooden trenchers and the soft tearing of bread. There was little conversation among the lower household. Only the occasional words of the steward or the rustle of a page stepping forward to refill a goblet with weak ale or wine. The walls bore little ornament. A hunting trophy here, a sword on display there, not for vanity, but to remind those present of strength, of lineage, of survival. In the shadows near the far end of the hall, scribes sometimes sat with wax tablets, copying inventories or recording accounts. Their work was slow and deliberate, interrupted only by the scratching of quills and the shifting of tired shoulders. Ink pots clinked gently as they were moved, carefully kept from spilling. Elsewhere in the keep, the day moved in layers. The upper chambers, reserved for nobility, were no more luxurious than the halls below, only quieter and slightly warmer. Narrow staircases led to them, winding in tight spirals, worn smooth at the center from centuries of footfall. The walls closed in as the steps climbed higher, and the air grew thin and still. In one such chamber, a lady sat near a narrow window. She was dressed in layered linen and fur-trimmed wool. Her embroidery hoop rested in her lap, the thread between her fingers unmoving. She listened, not to conversation, for there was none, but to the faint sound of bells in the courtyard, and the distant beat of hooves on damp earth. The keep had many such quiet moments. They filled the space like mist, seeping into corners and settling into stone. Children, if present, were rarely seen during the day. They were watched by tutors or nurses in a smaller firelit room, where lessons were given in reading psalms or handling small blades of wood. Their laughter was rare and subdued, like the flutter of birds beneath a roof. Servants moved from room to room with practiced silence. One might carry a platter of boiled barley and dried fruit from the kitchens. Another brought furs to air in the winter sun, carefully shaking them over the battlements, sending dust into the wind. A third would collect candle stubs, their tallow to be melted down and reformed by the hands of another. Every task had a place in the slow-turning wheel of castle life. Nothing moved quickly. There was no rush. Urgency belonged to the battlefield, not the keep. Below the great hall, the storage chambers waited in darkness. These were rooms of quiet necessity, filled with barrels of salted meat, sacks of rye, dried peas, and bundles of garlic braided tightly together. The air was earthy and still, broken only by the occasional drip of water against stone, or the soft scurry of a rat avoiding a trap. Even the light was different here. It came only from oil lamps, their flame yellow and small, casting long shadows along the vaulted ceilings. It was easy to forget the passage of time in these rooms. They were always dim, always cool. The outside world, with its shifting seasons and weather, did not touch them. The keep kept time not by clocks or sundials, but by hunger and work and prayer, by the sound of footsteps rising toward evening, by the chill that deepened in the walls as the sun lowered again beyond the towers. Soon, the hall would darken further, torches would be lit, and life would continue under flickering light as it had for generations. But the stone would never warm. It held its silence close, a silence older than memory, deeper than speech. And the people who lived within it, they did not fight that silence. They learned to live beside it. As the day softened into dusk, the rhythms of the castle grew slower. There were no curtains to draw, no gas lamps to light. The light simply changed, turning the halls from dull gray to quiet gold, and then from gold to blue, then to a deep, grainy shadow. The keep, already dim by day, surrendered easily to night. Along the corridor walls, torches were lit one by one. The flames danced, their reflections flickering on iron sconces and stone columns. The shadows they cast were long and strange, stretching like ancient memories along the floor. In the great hall, servants moved in quiet procession, clearing the trenchers and washing what could be salvaged from the evening meal. The scent of barley, smoked fish, and garlic still clung to the air. Nothing was wasted, not even the hardened ends of bread or the bones from stewed mutton. What remained was saved for broth, for dogs, or for those lower still in the castle order. The noble family, seated at the raised dais, retired early. Even in their long robes and fur-lined cloaks, the night's cold crept close. Their chambers, high in the keep, held braziers for warmth and the privilege of thicker bedding. Yet the stone walls breathed cold into every seam. In the quieter corners of the castle, maids banked fires with care, placing slow-burning logs into the hearth to last through the dark. They trimmed candles and gathered rushlights. Woolen curtains were drawn around beds to hold in warmth, while linen underlayers were shaken and turned. In one room, a child yawned beside a carved chest where her shoes had been tucked away for the night. A nurse lit a single candle, whispering no words at all, only humming the low tone of a cradle hymn from her own childhood, now almost forgotten. The flicker of the flame caught the edge of a wall tapestry, an embroidered saint with a golden halo, worn thin at the hem. The keep now hummed with softness. From the battlements, the guards paced slowly, their cloaks pulled tightly, their footsteps muffled in snow or frost. Below, the courtyard lay still. No torches there, only moonlight and the quiet sound of a distant owl. Inside, the air grew colder with each hour. The kitchens, once the warmest place in the keep, fell to stillness. The last cauldron was covered. The knives were laid flat. Wooden spoons rested against bowls turned upside down. The kitchen cat settled near the hearth, curled tightly, eyes blinking slowly, then not at all. Somewhere in the armory, a smith placed down his tools, the ringing of his hammer fading at last. The anvils glinted faintly in firelight. Rows of spears stood neatly against the walls, and a suit of armor, polished but empty, reflected the last light of the coals like a ghost in metal. In the lower chambers, deeper in the keep, the silence was thicker. Storage rooms sat untouched. Root vegetables slept in baskets. Cheese wheels aged slowly in cool, dark corners. Barrels of rainwater gathered condensation along their sides. The rats moved more freely now, their tiny claws scratching faint lines into wood, their tails thumping against empty sacks. And yet, it was peaceful. There was no panic, no hurry, no voices raised. The keep did not expect comfort, only stillness, only sleep. Above, the chapel bell rang once, a single soft toll to mark Compline, the night prayer. Its sound drifted through stone and wood and bone, touching the dreams of all who lived within. Even those who did not hear it stirred, ever so slightly, as if their bodies remembered the sound through years of repetition. And slowly, the castle settled. Blankets were drawn up to chins, fingers curled beneath furs, faces turned toward stone walls, familiar and cold. The firelight faded. The candles melted into puddles. The last footsteps echoed far away, faint as a heartbeat. And in that hush, that deep ancient hush, the keep did what it had always done best. It kept. It kept its people safe, however cold. It kept its memories, however faded. It kept its silence, through war, through time, and through sleep. And so the stone watched as night fell again, just as it had for hundreds of years before. In the medieval castle, warmth was not guaranteed. It was something to be sought, not found, not easily, and not often. The walls, thick as trees and cold as caves, held the chill like a secret. No matter the season, the stone remained cool to the touch. Even in summer, one could press a hand to the wall and feel the breath of winter beneath. And so, inside the keep and along its winding hallways, warmth became a quiet oar in the early morning, long before the first bell rang. The servants stirred, not from comfort, but from necessity. The first fire was lit by hands already cold in a hearth whose ash from the night before had barely cooled. The coals were stirred gently, and dry splinters of kindling were placed like offerings upon yesterday's embers. A breath, then another, and slowly, if the wood had been stored well, a flicker of flame would catch. Possession, a need that shaped every hour of the day. That small flame meant everything. It meant tea could be boiled, porridge could be made. Hands could hover for a moment over the grate and remember what it was to feel sensation return to fingers. But fire was not abundant, nor was it free. Each log had been cut by hand, dried by season, stacked with care in the woodshed beyond the curtain wall. Every piece of firewood was an item accounted for, especially in winter, when the carts could no longer bring more from the surrounding forest. What was inside the keep had to last, and so it was rationed. The great hall received its share. The kitchen, always in motion, kept a fire burning longer than most. But the smaller rooms, the side chambers, the storerooms, the stone corridors that led nowhere, they were left to the cold. Their silence deepened with frost. The hearth was not merely a source of heat, it was the soul of the room. It glowed faintly in the gloom, casting a soft red light that fluttered against the walls. Those who could sat close, not to talk, but to feel. Conversation became sparse in the presence of fire, not out of reverence, but fatigue. The warmth slowed the body. It made words less necessary. Clothing, too, was crafted with the cold in mind. Linen formed the base, soft against the skin, but too thin alone. Over it came wool, thick, coarse, but dependable. In winter, even woolen garments were layered, tunics over tunics, cloaks over dresses, gloves stitched from felt, or made of fur if the family was fortunate. Hoods were pulled low, stockings were wound tightly. Leather boots were stuffed with straw. In the halls of the keep, people did not walk quickly. Their movements were careful, deliberate, conserving warmth, avoiding drafts. Wind found its way through keyholes and cracks in the shutters. Sometimes it moaned softly through arrow slits, carrying with it the sharp breath of snow from the surrounding fields. Tapestries were hung along stone walls, not for beauty alone, but for insulation. Their woven threads caught warmth and held it a moment longer. Even straw, humble and dry, was useful. It was strewn across floors to lessen the touch of stone, and stuffed into bedding to trap the body's heat. And still, the chill remained. It was a permanent guest, never leaving, never speaking, but always present. One did not escape it, only adapt. Beds, when they came, were more than places to sleep. They were refuges. In the coldest months, 2 or 3 bodies might share the same mattress, separated by status, but bound by need. The heat of skin, the weight of blankets, the quiet murmur of breath in the dark, these were the only real defenses against the deep stone cold. And so each day, the castle lived in quiet negotiation with the cold. From morning to night, the fire was fed, the clothes were layered, the silence was wrapped in wool. And the people, tired but accustomed, made their peace with it. Because in the keep, there was no other choice. Warmth was not comfort, it was survival. A medieval keep was not built for comfort. It was built to endure. And so, warmth, fleeting as it was, had to be crafted from within. Stone, by its nature, could not hold heat. It absorbed the fire's gift and gave nothing back. Even the best-built hearth could not chase away the chill entirely. But every attempt was made. In the more fortunate chambers, wide fireplaces were set into the outer walls, thick-mouthed and blackened with generations of smoke. Their fires, when fed well, roared quietly, breathing out warmth that reached across the stone floor like a tired sigh. But not every hearth was generous. Many were narrow, shallow, and slow to heat. Sparks danced upward toward crude chimneys, built not for efficiency, but for survival. Smoke often hung low before it found its path upward, and the scent of burning oak mixed with the musty breath of old mortar and wet wool. Braziers were used where fireplaces could not reach. Simple iron basins, filled with hot coals, they sat in corners of quiet rooms, sending small ribbons of warmth into the air. Their glow was soft, their heat brief, and they were watched closely. A tipped brazier meant fire on the floor, danger in the dark. Servants carried warmed stones from the kitchen hearth and wrapped them in cloth. These were slipped beneath the bed covers before sleep, lending the illusion of comfort to those lucky enough to receive them. In noble rooms, they might be placed inside carved wooden bed frames, canopy beds with heavy drapes to trap breath and heat. The beds themselves became small sanctuaries. Feather mattresses, when available, were prized, but most slept on straw, renewed as often as supply allowed. The straw might be mixed with herbs like lavender, thyme, or rosemary, not only to soften the scent, but to keep insects at bay. Wool blankets were stacked thick and heavy. In winter, they were rarely removed. Some slept fully clothed, never shedding the day's garments. Removing layers was a luxury reserved for summer, or for those who had known a better fire. Doors groaned on iron hinges, letting in gusts each time they opened. Curtains were hung not for privacy, but to buffer against those sudden drafts. Window shutters, made of thick wood, were closed tightly before dusk, barring the wind, but not always the cold. In the hallways between rooms, breath fogged the air in thin white clouds. One could see it, the proof of the keep's breathless cold. Voices sounded different there, softened, hushed, as though even sound grew cold in that air. And yet, despite it all, warmth was found. It was in the center of the hearth where sparks rose. It was in the stillness shared by those gathered near it, hands outstretched, cloaks spread across shoulders. It was in the routines, the small decisions, placing a log just so, adjusting a brazier's coals, placing furs at the foot of the bed. Warmth became an art, quietly learned, not through luxury, but necessity. And through that necessity, the people of the keep came to understand something simple, that the body could survive the cold if the mind did not resist it, if one moved slowly, layered well, and shared what little fire could offer. And as night came once again, the castle drew inward, The fires were fed one last time. The braziers were checked. And each person, in their own quiet way, prepared to meet the cold not with fear, but with ritual, with patience, and with sleep. Evening settled over the keep, not like a blanket, but like a breath held too long. The shadows lengthened slowly. Light retreated behind shutters and doorways. Torches flickered in iron sconces, but they gave little heat. Their flames were quick to vanish in the wind that moved through unseen cracks. In the corners of the main hall, the fire sank low. What had crackled bright that morning now smoldered gently, collapsing into orange-red embers that blinked in the darkness. A few sat nearby still, quiet, their backs curved slightly toward the grate, seeking one last moment of warmth before retreating to stone chambers or straw pallets. Upstairs, in the higher rooms, preparations for the night moved gently. Maids unfurled heavy bedding, thick wool, animal skins, even dampened cloths heated by the hearth, and laid carefully into the center of the bed before their warmth faded. Curtains were drawn around the beds, not just to keep out light, but to trap breath, body heat, and the warmth of dreams. Sleep was not something one fell into easily in the keep. It was built, slowly, in layers. A shared glance toward the fire, a small murmured prayer beneath a fur blanket, the feel of woolen socks still damp from melted snow, and the sound, always the sound, of wind sighing across towers and through narrow stairwells. It was a wind that knew every corner of the castle, every loose shutter, every chink in the stone. Children were tucked two to a bed, or three, sometimes curled together like kittens. Their small bodies shivered beneath weighty quilts, but they did not complain. They had never known any other way to sleep. The old lay nearest the fire. The very young nestled beside them. The order of warmth was unspoken but understood. Whoever felt the cold longest would rest closest to the flame. In the chapel, a single candle burned beside the altar. The stone floor had long since gone cold, and the priest's breath was visible as he whispered his final prayers. Ancient words, unchanged for centuries, passed from lips to stone and then to silence. In the armory, no light remained, only the gleam of metal, catching moonlight through arrow slits. A sword lay on the table, polished but unused. A helmet rested beside it, filled with silence. Beneath the keep, deep in the cellar, the cold was complete. The barrels did not need fire. The root vegetables would outlast the season. No voices stirred there. Only the memory of footsteps remained. And then came the stillness. No bells, no voices, just the slow, steady quiet of a castle learning to sleep. The keep never became warm, not fully, but it learned to hold its own kind of peace, a warmth that did not come from fire alone, but from stillness, from routine, from shared spaces and slow breath, from woolen layers, from fire-touched stones, and from the simple nearness of other bodies, living and breathing beside one another in the dark. Outside, the wind sighed on, but inside, the keep kept watch. Its stones cooled, its hearths faded, and every room, from the kitchen to the chapel to the great chamber above, fell softly into silence. Long before the first frost touched the ground, the castle was already preparing for winter. Autumn had barely begun when the first bundles of herbs were hung upside down in the upper kitchens, tied with string and left to dry. Garlic, sage, thyme, and rosemary. Not for flavor alone, but for preservation, for health, for rituals passed down by quiet hands that remembered too many cold seasons. In the weeks after harvest, a different kind of work settled into the keep. It was not loud nor hurried, but it was constant. Barrels were filled, sacks were sewn, salt was carried in great, heavy bowls and pressed into layers of meat and fish. Carrots, turnips, onions, the thickest of the roots, were packed with straw into cellars, left to sleep in the dark for months to come. There were no pantries like today, no cupboards of glass or tins of plenty, only dark rooms beneath the keep, cool, quiet, damp. Here, the food of an entire winter was stored. Or so it was hoped. In these chambers, time moved differently. The air was still. Lanterns swung slowly from wooden beams, casting light across barrels that had been sealed and counted. Bread baked in autumn was left to grow stale, meant to last longer, to be soaked in broth or milk and eaten when all else was gone. Cheese wheels were waxed and turned. Beans were dried and stored in clay jars. Grains, barley, rye, oat, were layered in bins, safe from moisture, but never quite safe from pests. And always, always, there were rats. The castle tried to ignore them, but they lived beneath the floorboards and behind the walls, small and silent, their lives running parallel to the humans above. They could smell the salted pork. They knew the path to the grain bins, and if the stones cracked or the lids loosened, they would come. So the steward walked the storage rooms each day, lantern in hand, counting what remained. Listening for the smallest of sounds, scratching claws, gnawed wood, the whisper of movement in the dark. Not because he feared the rats, but because he feared what they meant. Every bit of food mattered. A single spoiled barrel could mean 10 fewer meals in February. A sack lost to dampness could send a child to bed with nothing in March. The people of the keep lived not by the comfort of full bellies, but by the math of endurance. They knew what each mouth consumed. They knew how many weeks were left until the first green sprouted again in the garden. And they knew that even with full cellars, winter was always longer than expected. By midwinter, the castle had grown quieter, not from sleep, but from conservation. Everything flowed. Footsteps in the halls, the stirring of pots, even the crackle of the fire. Outside, snow blanketed the outer walls. It muffled sound, buried paths, and turned the open courtyard into a wide, white stillness, marked only by boots and the brush of cloaks against the drift. Inside, the fires were smaller. Wood, once piled high in autumn, had already begun to shrink. The stacks in the covered lean-tos grew short, and the splinters carried into the hearths were chosen with care. A single good log might be set aside for Sunday, or for the eve of a feast, if such a day still called for one. In the kitchens, the meals changed, gently and without announcement. The bread grew thinner and darker, made with less flour, more oat husk. The stews contained more water and fewer pieces of meat. Dried peas were softened overnight and boiled into a paste that fed many, though it pleased none. The salt fish was soaked, then stewed, then eaten in silence, not because it was unpleasant, but because nothing else remained. The cook knew exactly how many jars of beans were left, She whispered their number to herself when no one was near. The children noticed first. Their portions grew smaller. A biscuit was no longer whole, but shared. A second bowl of porridge was no longer offered. They didn't complain. They only looked toward the hearth longer before sleep. In the noble chambers, the meals were still full. For now, a slice of game pie, a haunch of preserved boar. But even there, the sauces were thinner, the garnish more sparse. And even there, servants were sent away sooner to save the kitchen an extra ladle's worth. Hunger never announced itself all at once. It crept in, like the cold, silently, slowly. At first, it was only the lack of abundance, the missing second loaf, the empty bowl on the table where fruit had once been. Then it became the space between meals, wider than before, longer and more noticeable. Then it became part of the air. No one spoke of it, but it was felt. In the chapel, the priest gave sermons of endurance and temperance. He spoke of the desert fathers, of fasting as a virtue, of bread and water as the food of saints. And though few found comfort in it, none argued. It was better to believe it was holy than to admit it was necessity. In the storerooms, the steward now counted twice. His fingers moved across the lids of barrels like a prayer, tallying what could last and what might not. One sack of barley was found split. Another was damp from where the wall had leaked. Nothing was thrown away. Even spoiled flour could feed the pigs. If spring ever came, the pigs too had grown leaner. But tradition held a fattened sow at Lent, if all went well, a feast if the weather relented, a feast if the rats stayed away. And in every room the question lingered, unspoken but real. Would it last? Would the food stretch to the thaw? Would the wood warm the final weeks of cold? Would the illness pass before the stores ran out? No one could say. So they waited, not with dread, but with patience. And every meal, however small, was eaten slowly, as though by doing so, time itself might be lengthened. As the final weeks of winter drew near, the castle held its breath. The snow, once thick and proud, began to soften. The icicles hanging from the battlements grew thin and translucent, dripping slowly with the rhythm of day and night. Somewhere beneath the frozen soil, the first roots began to listen for warmth. But above ground, life in the keep remained unchanged, still rationed, still quiet. The great storerooms had changed in character. Where once they had brimmed with bins and baskets, they now held only shadows and silence. Empty barrels leaned against the walls, their lids resting beside them like hats removed in prayer. The smell of salt was faint now, no longer sharp, but tired. What remained was counted each morning. 3 onions, 2 wheels of cheese, 1 split, a sack of oats riddled with holes, a jar of honey crystallized and slow. These were not luxuries. They were markers of survival. Proof that someone had planned well, or that the winter had been just merciful enough. Up in the kitchens, meals became humble gestures. Boiled grains with dried herbs, flatbread baked from the last of the coarse flour, broth thickened with pebbles of dried meat and softened legumes. The cook no longer tasted each dish. She simply nodded as it was served, as if to say, "It will do." And it did. It always did, somehow. The people of the castle were leaner now. The fur-lined cloaks hung more loosely around shoulders. Even the animals moved more slowly. The cats curled into tighter circles, the dogs more watchful at the scent of stew. But there was, in the silence, a sense of peace, not joy, not plenty, but peace, a kind of soft agreement with the season. They had not conquered winter, but they had endured it. And so, in the last weeks of March, the mood began to shift. Ever so slightly, a few green tips appeared in the kitchen garden. Chives and wild garlic, strong enough to push through the thawing earth. The hens began to lay again. The milk, thin through the cold months, grew richer. And one morning, just past dawn, the steward passed through the stores with his tally sheet in hand. And for the first time in many months, he did not frown. Instead, he set the quill down, rubbed his hands, and allowed himself a long, deep breath. The stores had lasted, not by magic, not by excess, but by careful, quiet planning, by patience, by restraint, and by the understanding that winter was never something to defeat, only something to outlast. As the snow melted, and the first warm breeze passed over the stones of the castle wall, the people looked not for feast, but for rest. Their hunger had become part of them now, not pain, but memory. And in that memory, a quiet pride. The barrels were empty, the cellars were bare, but the castle still stood, and the people within had survived. Winter was not only a season of hunger. It was also a season of quiet suffering. The cold did not only settle in the bones, it settled in the blood, the lungs, the joints. It crept into the chest at night, turning soft breath into rasping coughs. It found the weak first, the very old, the very young, the wounded, and those already carrying burdens the rest could not see. There was no doctor in the castle, only the herbalist. She worked by the hearth, her fingers stained with tinctures and roots, her bowls warm from the kitchen fire. Her herbs hung above her like paper. The wheeze, the fever, the winter sweat, the blue lips, a sleep that will not lift. And so, the castle moved slowly during the coldest weeks. The pace of footsteps softened. The clatter of pots was less common. The rooms where the sick lay were kept dim, warmed with coals and candlelight. Children were hushed when they passed the door. Some recovered, most even, but not all. When one passed, the steward was the first to know. He would nod once, solemnly, then begin the quiet preparations. The grave could not be dug at once, not in the frozen ground. The body was wrapped in linen and laid in the chapel, watched over with prayer and a single candle that burned day and night. No grand displays, no drawn-out mourning, just silence and folded hands. The cold demanded simplicity, and the living, still tired, still hungry, still unsure of the season's end, they continued forward, not out of coldness, but because winter asked this of them, to keep moving. There was one room in the castle where silence fell even heavier than in the rest. The birthing chamber. It was not always a separate space. Sometimes it was just a warmer corner, near the kitchen hearth, or upstairs near the wool chests, where cloth and warm stones were kept close. But when the time came, the women of the castle gathered. Not loudly, not with fuss, but with quiet preparation. A wooden chair, a basin, rags clean and warm, candles placed in a circle, not for magic, but for focus, their light steady, their flicker soft. In winter, childbirth was more than pain. It was danger. The cold made everything slower. The blood flowed sluggishly. The breath turned shallow. If the baby came quickly, it was often safer. If not, if the labor stretched into a second night, or the winds howled outside the shutters, the risk grew. The midwife knew what herbs to offer. Raspberry leaf, mugwort, valerian root, steeped in boiled wine. She spoke gently, hands always warm, always steady. The mother gripped the arms of the chair or the edge of a blanket, her eyes closed against the candlelight. Sometimes the baby cried at once, a small, gasping sound that brought smiles, tears, soft laughter through weary throats. Other times, there was only silence. The midwife would nod. The women would begin their work. A cradle would not be filled that night, but life in the castle would go on. Outside the birthing room, others worked through the season with equal quiet. The injured soldier whose arm had not healed, the kitchen boy with frost-bitten toes, the hunter brought in with a broken leg, his boot frozen to his skin. There were no surgeons here, only the herbalist and sometimes the priest. Poultices were warmed and pressed to skin. Honey was used to clean wounds. Prayers were whispered over open flesh. Bandages were soaked in wine and wrapped again and again until the bleeding stopped, or it did not. Pain was not voiced loudly. To complain was to waste warmth. Instead, it was worn like a heavy cloak. And yet, amid the stillness, people endured. Even in sorrow, they kept moving. Not because it was easy, but because there was no other way. In the castle, where stone could not feel, the people had to feel for it. They held each other through long nights. They lit extra candles beside the sick. They spoke softly in the chapel when no one was there. And in the face of each small loss, they lit another fire, poured another bowl of broth, tucked another blanket around another shivering form. Because winter was not won in battle. It was survived in moments like these. By late winter, the griefs of the season had settled into the keep like a second chill. They were not loud. There were no great wails, no weeping in public halls. But the absences were felt. A bench left unoccupied, a cup not refilled, a single pair of shoes unworn by the fire. Some had passed in their sleep, others in the hush of the birthing room. A few in pain, a few in peace, but all had left behind quiet. In the chapel, a candle burned for each of them. The priest lit it at dusk with hands that trembled more than they once had. He did not name the departed aloud, but he remembered each face. The girl with the cough that never left her, the old man who had mended boots, the stable boy who hummed to the horses in the cold. Remembrance was a soft ritual. No grand monuments stood in their honor, no tombs lined with stone, just small things, a ribbon tied to a beam, a carved mark on the wooden wall, a bowl left by the window, filled with bread for the birds that still came, even in the snow. Sometimes in the upper rooms, one might find a woman sitting by the fire, holding a length of cloth that would never be worn. She did not cry. She simply sat and let the fire warm her hands. Children asked fewer questions in winter. They sensed when to be still, when to sit beside their elders without speaking, when to hold hands in sleep without needing to know why. In this quiet, there was no forgetting, but neither was there despair. Instead, there was a kind of folding, of sorrow into silence, of loss into routine. The castle did not stop for grief, but it bent to hold it. Every step taken in those halls was a step among ghosts, not haunting ones, but remembered ones, the ones who had sat at that table, or prayed at that altar, or tended that fire. And in remembering, the people found strength. They carried the names softly, passed on the stories in fragments, a favorite song, a way of stirring porridge, a bit of wisdom whispered by the hearth. And so, as the ice thinned and the light lingered longer past supper, the keep did not forget the weight winter had brought, but it let that weight become part of its rhythm, a rhythm that spoke not of survival alone, but of memory, of living beside what had been lost. And when the bells rang one morning, not for morning, but for spring, the people heard them not as a celebration, but as a sigh, the tolling of a season past, and the promise of a gentler one to come. As winter deepened, even the castle itself seemed to change. The same walls that had offered protection in summer now stood colder, harder, less forgiving. Each stone soaked in the frost, each corridor held its breath, and every corner carried the chill of stillness. The castle, once shelter, became a quiet, unfeeling challenge. The winding stone staircases inside the towers grew slick with condensation, and in some places, thin sheets of ice formed where footsteps had packed down snow from boots and cloaks. There were no handrails, only cold walls worn smooth by generations of hands. A misstep here could mean a twisted ankle, a broken leg, or worse. In the dark of early morning, when even the torches gave little warmth, these spiral paths were more treacherous than any battlefield. They carried the names softly, passed on the stories in fragments, a favorite song, a way of stirring porridge, a bit of wisdom whispered by the hearth. And so, as the ice thinned and the light lingered longer past supper, the keep did not forget the weight winter had brought, but it let that weight become part of its rhythm, a rhythm that spoke not of survival alone, but of memory, of living beside what had been lost. And when the bells rang one morning, not for morning, but for spring, the people heard them not as a celebration, but as a sigh, the tolling of a season past, and the promise of a gentler one to come. The main gate was thick with iron and oak, and its mechanisms were heavy and stubborn. In the heart of winter, ice formed along the chains and grooves. Lowering or raising the portcullis became a chore of grunts and hammers, the metal groaning with resistance. In times of sudden threat, such delay could cost lives. Even within safety, no one trusted the gate entirely when the cold held it fast. The tallest towers offered the widest view and the deepest cold. Thin arrow slits let in more than sightlines. They let in wind. Guards who climbed to the top carried blankets, spare mittens, and hot stones wrapped in wool. But still, their fingers went numb. Breath froze on beards. Oil and lanterns thickened to sludge. Time passed slowly in those watchposts, not counted by hours, but by how many times a man could stamp his feet before feeling returned to his toes. A castle moat, usually a liquid line of defense, froze in winter. But it didn't freeze clean. In places, it cracked. In others, it stayed thin, hiding its weakness beneath a sheet of snow. Servants fetching water with buckets might fall through in an instant, soaked to the bone, shivering, panicked. The drawbridge itself became stiff, its wooden slats brittle and frostbitten. No one crossed quickly. Every step was taken with care. Above all, the castle's stone walls were not passive. They held the cold. They absorbed it deeply during the night and released it slowly, stubbornly, long after the sun had risen. Touching a wall with bare skin felt like pressing into ice. Sitting upon stone benches chilled the bones. Even beds against exterior walls stayed frigid, no matter how many blankets were piled above them. The castle was not cruel, but in winter, it was indifferent. Its duty was to stand, not to comfort. And so, those within learned to live not only with the wind and snow, but with the silence of stone. Stone that could not be warmed, only endured. Here's a quiet look at how class shaped winter, not with loud contrasts, but through small, daily details. In a castle where everyone felt the cold, rank still decided how much warmth one could keep. In the great hall, the noble family dined and gathered beside the largest fire in the keep. The hearth burned high, logs as thick as a man's arm, flames licking upward, warming stone walls hung with faded tapestries. But even there, the warmth did not travel far. By the time one stood a few paces back, the cold returned. Servants standing nearby felt it in their fingers. The fire was generous in flame, but not in reach. Warmth belonged to proximity and permission. The lowest rooms of the castle, where the walls met the earth, held the servants' quarters. Some slept near the kitchen ovens when they could. Others curled beneath rough blankets near grain sacks, hoping their breath would warm the straw. There were no bed frames here, only pallets. A shared blanket between two meant more warmth, but also less rest. Still, they whispered softly in the night, lullabies and prayers, until sleep crept in like warmth through cloth. The noble family wore wool-lined cloaks, velvet sleeves, and mittens trimmed with fur. Below stairs, servants mended last year's hose. Gloves were shared. Cloaks were turned inside out to hide worn patches. A single hole could mean frostbite by sunrise. No one was untouched by winter, but status decided how much one could mend, replace, or simply endure. In winter, no one bathed often. The water was too cold, the risk of chills too great. Nobles wiped down with cloths and perfumes. Herbal sachets were crushed and worn beneath garments. The poor, they waited for spring, hoping the fires stayed lit and that their skin didn't crack. But the smells, sweat, tallow, smoke, were more tolerated on lords than on the ones who served them. The stew pot warmed all hands, but not all mouths equally. At the high table, the meat was tender and well spiced. For the kitchen staff, it was thinner, stretched with oats and broth. Yet there was no resentment, only routine. Everyone knew their share. Still, sometimes, a kind cook would sneak a bit of fat or bread to the youngest stable boy. And when that happened, it tasted like a feast. Even in the stillness of winter, the castle did not sleep. Its stone heart beat quietly, sustained by those who moved through its corridors with buckets, tools, ladles, and prayer. From dawn to dusk, and sometimes through the night, there were tasks that could not wait for warmth. Long before the sun rose, the firekeepers stirred. Wrapped in layers of wool and sleep, they lit their tapers from the embers saved overnight and moved silently from hearth to hearth. Their job was simple but sacred. Rekindle every fire in the keep before the household woke. Some mornings, the coals were cold. Then the flint had to be struck again and again, sparks catching on dry bark and breath. Without their hands, the castle would never rise. Water was never easy to fetch in winter. The castle well had a crust of ice that had to be chipped each morning. Buckets drawn up dripped with cold. Inside, the water froze in basins if left untouched too long. The servants who bore it did so carefully, fingers red with cold, arms aching from the weight. But it was needed. For cooking, for washing, for the animals that waited in the frost-bitten stables. High above, the watchmen stood guard. Their cloaks caught the wind. Their boots froze to the stone. They watched the forest for smoke, the road for riders, the sky for omen or threat. But mostly, they watched time pass, slowly, frost-bitten, hour by hour. Sometimes, they sang under their breath to stay awake. Sometimes they muttered prayers. And always they counted how many bells remained until they were relieved. Even when the rest of the castle slumbered, the kitchen stirred softly. A pot left over the fire, bread rising slowly in the dark, meat thawing beside a brick warmed in the embers. The cook often rose twice each night, once to check the heat, once to check the broth. Her rhythm was not dictated by clock or sun, but by hunger and the memory of how quickly food cool. Winter did not wait for better weather to break something. A broken shutter, a cracked stair, a roof tile torn loose by the wind. The carpenter worked in gloves, if he had them. The blacksmith lit his forge slowly, warming his tools before touching cold metal. The mason patched with snow-packed mortar, doing what he could to stop a leak before nightfall. Each task was small, but necessary, because when the castle broke, it let the cold in, and once it entered, it was slow to leave. In the coldest weeks, the people of the castle were not alone in their endurance. Beneath the stone floors, behind wooden doors, and deep in the hay-sweet stables, the animals waited out the snow in their own hushed way. Some were working beasts. Some were kept for meat. A few were companions. All were part of the keep's quiet, beating heart. The stables were dark and warm with breath. The horses stood close to one another, sharing body heat. The walls thick with hay bales to block the drafts. Their flanks shimmered faintly in the torchlight, steaming from the day's ride or a restless shift in the night. Their hoofs were checked daily. Blankets of coarse wool covered their backs. Apples were rare now, oats carefully rationed. But the stable hands moved gently among them, whispering, brushing, always watching. The chickens did not lay as they once did. In winter, the hens grew sluggish. Their combs paled. They tucked their beaks into their feathers and roosted for long hours in the coop, huddled for warmth. only a few eggs each week now, and those were treasured. Their straw was changed often. A single candle burned near the nesting boxes to offer false light. Still they clucked lowly, as if in protest of the season. But they endured, as they always had. The pigs in the lower pens were fed scraps, boiled peels, cold mash, wilted greens. There was little for them to root now, no soft ground. So they burrowed into their straw, one atop the other, snoring softly like great furred sacks. They did not mind the cold, so long as they had each other. The cook sometimes passed by and nodded to them, silently counting how many would see Lent. But for now, they were left in peace. The castle dogs were leaner in winter. They curled at thresholds, near kitchen doors, beside the guards' boots at the gate. They did not bark unless truly needed. They watched, they followed, and when the fire burned low, they curled beside sleeping feet, sharing what warmth they could. No one ordered them to do so, they simply knew. Beneath the floorboards, small creatures stirred. Mice, mostly. Sometimes a weasel. Once, a stoat with white fur. They slipped through cracks into grain bins beneath beds. The castle cat, half asleep on a windowsill, would twitch her ear now and then, but she no longer chased. There was no war between man and mouse in winter. Only coexistence. After all, everything was cold, everything was hungry, and everything just wanted to last until spring. Not every winter day in the castle was cold silence. Even in the depths of snow and hunger, there were moments, fleeting and fragile, when warmth returned. Not always from the fire, but from fellowship. From voices, laughter, memory, and music that drifted like smoke. These were the hours people remembered longest, not because they were grand, but because they were shared. In early February, when the cold still clung to every window pane, the castle paused for Candlemas. The chapel was lit with small beeswax candles, one for each room in the keep. They were carried in solemn procession, then left to flicker gently on every sill, every niche. Afterward, a quiet meal, fresh bread if there was flour, soup with herbs, and perhaps honeyed milk if the goats were generous. No revelry, but peace and light. When work was done and the fires were high, stories were told. An elder might speak, his voice scratchy, slow, of winter wolves, of saints who walked barefoot through snow, of ghostly hunts in the forest. Children listened with wide eyes, fingers wrapped around mugs of weak broth or warm cider. No one asked if the stories were true. That was never the point. In the hall, when spirits lifted, games were played. Dice on a wooden board, knucklebones tossed near the fire, simple riddles exchanged with a smile. The servants played, the squires watched, and sometimes even a noble joined in. Laughter echoed, soft and low. Not wild, just enough to remind everyone that spring would come, eventually. Before Easter, Lent would begin, and with it came fasting. No meat, no indulgence. For the poor, it was barely a change, but for the wealthy, it meant restraint. Cheese and eggs were set aside. Rich dishes gave way to stews and salted fish. It was a hunger not forced by season, but chosen for the soul. And because it was shared, it somehow felt lighter. Some nights brought no song, no feast, no story. Only the crackle of firewood, the creak of beams, a soft cough from across the hall. And in that quiet, something sacred was felt. A stillness, older than the castle itself. Not loneliness, just winter. In its simplest, truest form. And in that silence, people breathed, slept, endured, together. The children of the castle were not spared the cold, but they met it differently, with eyes wide open, with hands outstretched to catch snowflakes, with quiet wonder, even when the days were gray. Their winter was a mixture of duty and play, of small joys and silent lessons, passed down by firelight. The youngest ones wore all they could, wool tunics over wool hose, hoods pulled low, mittens sewn from scraps. Still, the cold found its way in. Little fingers grew red, cheeks rosy, noses always running. They did not complain. They ran through snowdrifts near the keep's edge, made tiny forts in the courtyard, and returned breathless to the kitchens for a crust of bread and a hand held out to the fire. By the age of 6 or 7, children worked, not hard, not like their parents, but enough to learn. They fetched water in small pails. They gathered straw for the animals. They brushed the coats of tired horses and swept the steps where ice gathered. It gave them pride, purpose, and when someone thanked them with a smile or a kind word, they beamed as though they had lit the fire themselves. Not every child learned letters, but all learned something. By the hearth, older children were taught how to count coins, mend cloth, or name herbs. A boy might learn how to tie a proper knot. A girl might learn to mix honey with warm milk for a fever. There were no blackboards, no quills, just memory, passed down in murmured words and practiced hands. They played with what they had, a ball stuffed with rags, a hoop carved from wood, footprints turned into mazes in the snow. Hide and seek beneath cloaks hanging from the line. Laughter came easily to them, not loud, not disruptive, but soft and delighted, like the music of bells in a distant chapel. Even the oldest knight, passing by, might smile at the sound. At night, children slept close, to a parent, to a sibling, to a bundled-up dog or cat that found its way into the blankets. The wind might howl outside, but inside, the rhythm of sleep was steady. A tangle of limbs, soft breath, quiet dreams. In the morning, the straw would be flattened, the blanket crooked, the coals still glowing, and the children would rise again into another cold day, with bright eyes, bare feet, and wonder still intact. Time softens stone, and snow, for all its stillness, preserves. Beneath ruined towers and broken keeps, beneath frostbitten walls long forgotten, the remains of medieval winters rest quietly in layers of earth. Over centuries, archaeologists have brushed them free, not with violence, but with gentleness, with care. And slowly, piece by piece, winter begins to speak again. At the heart of most excavated castles lies a dark layer of ash, charcoal bits, burnt bone, sometimes fragments of scorched cloth. These are the remnants of fires tended by hands now lost to time. The size of the hearths tells stories, some grand and wide for halls, others small and intimate, meant for family. In winter, every fire mattered. Every coal was placed with hope. And in the soot left behind, we see the warmth they built, even when the world froze outside. Castle latrines, tucked into high tower nooks or hidden corners, froze solid during deep winter. Archaeologists have found these ancient waste shafts, filled not only with what was discarded, but with what was forgotten. Bones of small animals, broken combs, buttons, bits of preserved cloth, even lost rings, slipped from fingers numb with cold. It's in these frozen archives that we find a human winter, messy, real, filled with small accidents and quiet moments of carelessness. Stone floors inside castles were sometimes layered, rushes laid down, then replaced, then trampled again. Over time, this layering built a quiet history of footsteps, crushed herbs, bits of food, a bead from a dress, a child's tooth. In one ruin, archaeologists found a compacted layer of dried mud and straw, pressed down in winter by boots and hooves. The doorway was narrow and the threshold worn, showing how traffic in and out of the keep increased in stormy weather, as everyone sought the fi. Among the most telling remains are animal bones, not just from feast days, but from lean months. Rabbit bones, brittle and gnawed, bones of songbirds, even cats in some cases, their remains mixed with kitchen waste. These speak of hard winters, when survival came before sentiment, and the line between companion and sustenance blurred. Yet alongside them, carved spoons, painted pottery, and prayer tokens, proof that people still clung to ritual and beauty, even when hunger pressed hardest. In some castle ruins, especially those buried for centuries, archaeologists find footprints, not fossilized, but pressed into clay-like soil where snow once melted, then froze again. A child's heel, a soldier's boot, the bare imprint of a woman's foot beside a basin once used for washing. These are the softest stories, the ones never written down, the ones told not in words, but in weight, in pressure, in presence. Ghosts, not of fear, but of belonging. When the snow melted, it sometimes took things with it. A mitten dropped beside the stable, a wool cap lost beneath a bench, a wooden toy fallen through a crack in the floor. These small, unnoticed things, touched daily, needed deeply, were rarely recorded in chronicles. But they waited quietly under stone, earth, and silence. And when uncovered, centuries later, they still carried the memory of winter. In several sites, fragments of hand-stitched mittens have been found, wool shrunk and stiff with time, still bearing the imprint of thumbs, loose ends tucked in. Some were layered with linen, others patched again and again. They were not luxurious, but they mattered, because a warm hand meant a steady grip, a kind gesture, or simply the ability to keep working through the frost. One pair, found near a castle gatehouse, was child-sized, forgotten beside a cracked wooden toy. No feast could be held without them, yet spoons were so common they were almost invisible to record. In the ash layers of kitchens and servants' quarters, archaeologists find them often, bent slightly from years of stirring hot stews, tips blackened from resting too close to flame, handles worn smooth by winter hands. Some bore initials carved in soft lines, a mark of ownership, or a quiet wish that it wouldn't be lost among dozens. In buried rooms beneath fallen towers, rusted iron keys have been found tucked into corners or wedged between stones. Some opened food stores, some private rooms, others no one knows. In winter, keys were precious. Locked doors held warmth, or cheese, or secrets. To carry one was a responsibility, and to lose it meant trouble. When archaeologists find one, they often pause and imagine what it once protected on a night thick with snow. Among the most common artifacts left from castle winters are spindle whorls, small round stones or clay discs used to weight thread as it spun. Dozens have been found, dropped by women spinning wool by firelight, forgotten under benches. Some made of smooth stone, others carved with tiny decorations, stars, crosses, simple flowers. Each one turned hours of waiting into something useful. Thread meant warmth, and spinning filled long evenings with purpose. In a collapsed corner of one castle's servant hall, a wooden cart was discovered. Simple, small, with one broken wheel and a string for pulling. Likely carved by a father or older brother. Likely left behind in a rush, perhaps at bedtime or in illness. Archaeologists found it untouched beneath centuries of dust, still whole, still quietly waiting, a whisper from a child who once laughed, even when snow coated the stones outside. Even the cold could not keep people from prayer. In the chapels of stone keeps and village churches alike, winter pressed close, through the windows, across the floor, into breath and bone. But still they came, wrapped in cloaks, clutching candles, whispering psalms. They came not only for salvation, but for comfort. And in those echoing, icy spaces, faith and folklore twined together, softly like smoke. Inside the chapel, the stone floor was often colder than outside, even as candles flickered and incense rose in curls. The cold pressed upward through boots and knees. Winter sunlight, filtered through thick glass or open slits, cast a pale blue across the altar. And yet people knelt, sometimes for hours, wrapping cloaks tighter, whispering Latin words in trembling voices. There was no warmth in the floor, but sometimes there was warmth in the silence that settled after the final amen. In certain regions, there were special rites during long winters. A priest might sprinkle holy water across the frozen threshold, or read verses aloud beneath the open sky, asking for mercy from the frost. In some places, candles were blessed and carried around the castle perimeter, forming a soft, glowing circle of light. It was part belief, part tradition, a way of saying to the cold, "We see you, we endure you, but you do not rule us." Certain saints became companions in the cold months. Saint Blaise was prayed to for sore throats. Saint Brigid for warmth and hearth. Saint Nicholas, not jolly then, but austere and watchful, was honored with bread and stories. Children heard their names like lullabies. The statues wore shawls of frost, and in the dark of night, when the chapel door creaked in the wind, some swore they heard footsteps, soft and slow, like a saint keeping vigil. Not all rituals came from the church. Under mattresses, folk charms were hidden, herbs tied with red string, old bones buried near doors, wax figures left behind barns. These were the older beliefs, half remembered and quietly passed down. No one spoke of them openly, but they were there. Little protections for the days when even prayer seemed to freeze in the air. When the chapel bell rang in winter, it sounded different. The snow softened its echo. The air carried it longer. Those in the fields paused to listen. Those inside crossed themselves quietly. The bell marked time. Morning mass, evening prayer, the feast day of a long-forgotten saint. And even when food was short and breath clouded in the nave, that bell reminded them the world still turned. Faith still held. Spring would come, eventually. Books do not like the cold. Parchment tightens, ink fades, binding cracks. And yet, within the quietest chambers of castles and monasteries, there were always those who tended to the written word, even as frost crept in. Scribes, monks, stewards, quiet keepers of wisdom, guarding thoughts from centuries past while snow gathered at the windowsill. Winter came for many things, but it never claimed the mind. The scriptorium was rarely warm, a narrow room, high windows, long desks. Ink pots grew sluggish in the cold, and breath left clouds above the page. The monks or scribes wore fingerless gloves, cloaks wrapped tight, candles flickering on stands. Still they worked, copying psalms, histories, herbal recipes, and forgotten stories from worn scrolls. Line by line, each stroke of the quill a soft act of resistance against silence. In the deepest winters, books were swaddled, wrapped in linen, tied in bundles, placed in wooden chests, lined with dried herbs, rosemary, sage, and lavender, to ward off moisture and rot. In some castles, the steward of the library would light a small brazier once a week and air the pages one at a time, whispering softly as if waking them from sleep. The books did not speak, of course, but they remembered. Ink was handmade, from oak galls, iron salts, and wine or vinegar. But in winter it thickened. To write, a scribe might warm the ink bottle near the fire, then cradle it in wool between strokes. Some mixed it fresh every morning, muttering under their breath like cooks at a winter hearth. It was said that ink made in winter faded more gently over time, its letters softer, its voice quieter, a kind of snow upon the page. In the noble court, appearance still mattered. Even in bitter chill, ladies wore long gowns layered with silk and wool, belts studded with jet or brass, and fur-lined hoods embroidered with pale thread. Lords fastened brooches beneath their chin, draped capes that swept the floor, and carried walking sticks carved with animals of winter. The cold bit, but it did not win. Dignity, like a second cloak, held firm. Behind the great formality, there were secrets. A whispered promise near the stairs, a letter slipped behind a goblet, eyes meeting briefly above a veil. Winter slowed things, but it made spaces linger longer. Shadows stretched, moments deepened, words carried farther. Even the cold in its silence could not hush intrigue. And in castles of power, winter was not just endured, it was watched carefully. Even in stone and paint, winter left its mark, though not always directly. Snow and frost were not often named in words, but they lingered in symbols, hidden in carvings above doorways, in embroidered banners, on shields and tiles and tapestries that swayed gently in the hull. These quiet signs spoke to the hearts of those who lived through long, hard seasons, not as warnings, but as memories. The pine cone and the sleeping bear, in carvings above chapel doors or on cornerstones of keeps, Symbols like pine cones and sleeping animals often appeared. The pine cone meant endurance, the seed that waited untouched all through winter. The bear, shown curled and peaceful, spoke of retreat and rest, not death, a reminder that stillness was natural, that one could wait and wake and live again. These were not grand messages, but they were known to all. In old heraldic records, some families changed their crests in winter. Bright colors dulled, gold replaced with gray, symbols of battle replaced with candles, stars, or closed gates. These weren't changes for war, but for rhythm. Even banners needed to rest. And when the wind howled through the castle court, a muted standard could say, softly, "Now is the time for silence." Along the edges of medieval tapestries, tiny motifs often appeared, unnoticed by many, little spirals, meant to resemble frost crystals, loops like frozen vines, stars with 6 points, embroidered in pale thread that caught the firelight faintly. These were not symbols of fear, they were celebrations of the beauty found in hardship, of pattern in chaos, of the sacred geometry of snow. Artists of the time used architecture as metaphor. A painting might show a figure beside a closed door, hands folded, snow piled against the frame. To viewers, it meant spiritual waiting, the soul paused, humble, quiet before a greater thaw. It echoed real life too. In castles, a closed window was survival, a sealed gate, peace. And so in art, perhaps the most enduring winter symbol was the candle, held by saints, by children, by hooded travelers. A single flame in a dark frame. Over time, it came to mean hope, not grand or loud, but small and brave. The light one carried through a corridor with frozen stone. The light that said, "We are still here." In castle art, it appeared again and again, in stone, in wood, in worn paint. A whisper, a glow, a promise, became signs not of retreat, but of wisdom. Winter visited everyone, but it did not treat them all the same. In a castle, the cold slipped through stone and straw alike. Yet those with titles and coin met it behind thick drapes, with silver dishes and sable cloaks. While others, the cooks, the grooms, the maids and boys, felt it first in their bones and bore it longer. The season was shared, but unequally. In the great hall, the lord sat beneath painted beams. His cloak was heavy, lined with squirrel or fox, trimmed in ermine if wealth allowed. Beneath it, a velvet tunic, gloves of leather, boots stuffed with wool. His chair, draped in fleece, stood closest to the hearth. Even so, his fingers stiffened, the ink in his seal pot thickened. But he was not cold like those outside his view. He sipped hot wine, he nodded slowly, he endured the season with elegance. Below, in the scullery, the maid worked with sleeves rolled high. Water turned to slush in her bucket, her hands red and raw. She wore 2 tunics, one patched, one too short, and a shawl held with a bone pin. Her shoes, if she had them, were damp with melted snow from the stone floor. She did not complain, not aloud, but she dreamed of a summer day, just once, where her hands would not ache. At night, the difference widened. The lord and his family slept in chambers with drapes. Thick fabric hung around the bed, trapping heat and muffling wind. A brazier might glow faintly in the corner. Pelts lined the mattress. Silence was soft. The servants slept near the dying embers of the kitchen fire, curled on rushes. Sometimes 2 or 3 to a blanket. Sometimes with a dog tucked at their feet. They did not have privacy, but they had each other. At the high table, winter meals came with spice. Cinnamon, pepper, cloves, ground into stews, poured over preserved fruits, stirred into wine. Salted meats, sugared almonds, candied ginger. In the kitchens, the workers made do. Bone broth, a ladle of cabbage soup, bread if any was dark and hard-edged. On better days, a slice of eel pie or the skin from a roast. Everyone ate, but not the same. And so the castle held 2 winters, One of fur, spice, firelight, and tapestries. The other of splinters, drafts, aching limbs, and breath turned to mist indoors. But both heard the wind whistle through the same towers. Both prayed for the same sun to return. And when the bells rang in spring, both smiled, because every winter, no matter how cold, was survived together. Even in winter, the castle did not sleep. Lords summoned councils. Ladies welcomed visitors. Pages rushed down cold corridors with letters and cloaks. The business of the realm continued, even as frost traced every window. Within the great hall, the rituals of nobility pressed on, slower, quieter, softened by snow, but still dignified. For winter, to them, was not just endured, it was performed. The lord's court gathered even in midwinter, beneath chandeliers dimmed by smoke, beneath banners that barely stirred in the still air. Men in heavy cloaks read disputes. Women sat in silence, gloved and pale beneath veils. The fireplace roared, but heat did not travel far. Steam rose from breath. Ink cracked on the scrolls. But the laws were read and heard, because even cold could not still custom. A noble feast in winter was a contrast of warmth and chill. The tables groaned with game and roast chestnuts, but the hall stayed cold around the edges. Goblets steamed. Spices stung the nose. The laughter was measured, not boisterous, but rich and steady, echoing among stone and candlelight. Musicians played with stiff fingers. Dancers moved slowly, wrapped in velvet. It was a celebration not of plenty, but of endurance, and the wine tasted sweeter because of it. Visitors still came, messengers, minor nobles, monks with wrapped scrolls. They arrived shivering, their boots caked with slush, their cloaks stiff with frost. Pages helped them undress by the fire. Servants brought warm broth, and the mistress of the house offered a pale smile and warm hands. In that moment, the threshold became sacred, a line between storm and shelter. Guests were precious in winter. They brought stories, news, and sometimes laughter. Cold brought with it long hours, and sometimes those hours brought boredom. In the margins of old books, scribes doodled. Tiny dragons curled in loops of letters. Monks with oversized ears. Stars, cats, sleeping faces. One even wrote, "The cold is great today. My fingers are stiff. May this line be the last." It wasn't. But in that margin, winter lives still, inked beside prayers and kings. Even when no one wrote or read, the library had its own hush. Snow padded the outside world. Inside, the pages rested. The dust gathered slowly. A candle flickered. A mouse nibbled on glue in the binding. The steward, wrapped in wool, closed the door and whispered to the dark, "Sleep well, little ones. I'll return at first thaw." And so the library waited, like the land, not dead but dreaming. She did not raise her voice. She did not pace the halls. Yet through frost and silence, the lady of the keep kept everything moving, from hearth to high table, from chamber to chapel. In winter, her role deepened. More mouths to feed, more cloth to mend, more letters to send, more peace to keep. And though the stone walls were cold, her presence softened them. She was warmth, not loud, but lasting. At first light, her chamber stirred. A handmaid placed warm stones at her feet. A comb ran gently through her hair. In the background, servants whispered, bringing cloth, notes, reports. She took a seat near the window, where light caught the frost like glass beads. There she read the steward's lists, chose herbs for medicine, and decided what cloth would be cut that day. Winter began, each day, with her quiet choices. She was often found by the fire, not resting, but weaving. Her fingers moved over wool, linen, or fine silk, repairing a collar, mending socks for her children, stitching a gift for a visiting noble. She taught others too. Girls from the village, nieces, young maids, seated at her feet on straw mats, learning needlework, not just as craft, but as tradition. A soft line that stretched across generations. Thread was memory, and she spun it well. Every afternoon, she walked the keep, not rushed, not loudly, but with presence. She visited the kitchens, nodding to the cook, touched the forehead of a child in the infirmary, spoke gently to the steward near the gate, left a dried orange peel in the chapel, as was her winter custom. She did not need to be seen often. Once was enough. Her footsteps meant things were in order. At her desk, as evening fell, she wrote, by candlelight, slowly, with care. Notes to her sister across the valley, instructions for a cousin's wedding, recipes passed down, copied onto vellum, a prayer tucked into each. Wax sealed, stamped with her ring, a branch of fir and 3 stars. In her words, there was calm. In her silence, a kind of wisdom that lingered longer than the fire itself. Some believed noble women were idle in winter, but they did not see what she carried. Sick servants, failing stores, bitter disputes between tenants, a child with fever, a husband fretting over snowbound roads. And still, she remained, poised, composed, steady. She did not wield a sword, but she kept the castle whole. When the snow piled high and the wind howled low, time moved differently inside the castle walls. The fields were silent, the roads impassable. And so, the people turned inward, toward music, stories, games, and small joys lit by firelight. It wasn't merriment in the grandest sense, but it was warmth. And it helped the nights feel shorter. Near the hearth, nobles and children alike gathered around carved boards. 9 men's Morris, fox and geese, tables, an early cousin of backgammon. The pieces were smooth, bone, wood, sometimes bits of colored glass. Hands moved slowly across the board, warmed by flickering flames, as conversation drifted like smoke above them. No one rushed. There was nowhere to be, and the fire told better stories than any winter ever did. Music filled the evenings, softly and without spectacle. A troubadour, if present, might strum a lute with gloved fingers. A harpist, often a lady of the household, plucked slow melodies, notes echoing against the stone walls. The songs were old, ballads of saints, lovers, distant wars. But the voices were quiet, low enough to fall asleep to. A hush that lingered even after the last string stilled. One of the oldest games was not a game at all. It was a question. What walks on 4 legs in the morning? The nobleman posed it with a smile. The page answered wrong. Laughter warmed the room more than the fire did. There were also stories, fables, legends, tales of knights and foxes and frost spirits who stole firewood. Some stories were true, most were not. But no one minded. They were winter's gift. In a corner of the hall, women gathered with hoops of linen and silk thread. No one needed to speak. One stitched a rose, another a falcon. A girl embroidered her name for the first time, the thread trembling slightly in her hand. The sound of the needle-piercing cloth was like the ticking of a soft clock. Quiet, rhythmic, soothing. A kind of music but made of thread instead of notes. If the household was large, there might be a fool, not loud, not wild, but gentle in the winter months. He'd juggle apples, tell stories backward, mimic the steward with perfect seriousness. The lady of the house smiled. The cook shook her head, hiding a laugh. His role was not just to amuse, but to soften the edge of a hard season. And his voice, echoing lightly down the corridor, reminded everyone that joy still lived in the cold. Perfect. Even in the depths of snow and silence, life moved forward. A promise was made, a union blessed. And for a moment, in the frostiest months, A castle glowed with joy, gentle, candlelit, hushed beneath the vaulted beams. Winter did not often lend itself to weddings, but when it did, they became memories. Deep, bright, and enduring, like light through stained glass. Not every wedding came with fanfare. Sometimes it was simple. A vow spoken before a hearth, a priest murmuring Latin, the bride's hands trembling in fur-lined sleeves. The guests wore cloaks. Their breath hung in the air, but the words still mattered. Love did not wait for spring, nor did duty, and in the stillness of snow, their union felt more sacred somehow, like a promise made before the whole sleeping world. Winter brides wore heavy gowns, often blue or pale green, the colors of frost and sky. Over her shoulders, a cloak of wool or velvet embroidered with silver thread. In her hair, woven candles flickered as she walked, their tiny flames barely bending as she passed beneath stone arches. She carried herbs instead of blooms, rosemary, sage, dried lavender. The scent mingled with the cold and the smoke of the braziers. She was grace in motion. The wedding meal was simple but rich. The fruits of patience and careful storage, salted meat, spiced wine, dried pears and apples rehydrated in honey and clove, almonds roasted over flame, a pie with winter greens. Each bite tasted of effort, of months spent planning, of cellars checked and shelves tended, and around the table, laughter grew warmer with every toast. A single flute, a drum with a softened hide, a voice singing a tune that was older than the walls themselves. The guests did not dance wildly. The hall was too cold for that. But they swayed, they clapped gently. A child spun in circles, and an old knight nodded with a tear in his eye. Music in winter was a thread. It stitched people together, reminding them that joy was still possible. When the wedding ended and the guests stepped outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft, silent, steady. The bride and groom paused beneath the gatehouse. Snowflakes caught in their hair, and all around them the keep hushed, not out of reverence, but out of peace. Someone whispered, "That's a good omen." And it was, for the snow blessed everything it touched, and then melted into memory. When winter deepened, so did the silence. Behind thick curtains and closed shutters, illness crept in, slow, soft, and uninvited. A cough in the corridor, a pale cheek near the fire, a fever that flickered like a dying flame. Within castle walls, disease moved gently, not in thunder, but in whispers. It was not a time of panic, but a time of watching, waiting, praying. It often began with a shiver, a child with cold fingers, a knight who rose late, a serving girl with red eyes. No one rushed to speak it aloud. Illness in those days was not something summoned by name, so the steward added more straw to the bedding. A maid brewed a tisane of thyme and sage. The priest lit a small candle and whispered a prayer. Everyone noticed, but no one said it. Most castles had no true infirmary. Just a chamber with thick drapes, a stool, and a stack of blankets. In one corner, a mortar and pestle. In another, dried herbs hanging like shadowy garlands. Horehound for cough, hyssop for breath, elderberry for heat. The castle healer, if there was one, moved quietly through it all, wiping foreheads, dosing spoonfuls, listening to breathing, not always curing, but always comforting. That, in winter, was medicine enough. When the illness worsened, the sick were moved to the upper rooms, the colder rooms, away from the fire, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Illness spread like smoke in a hallway. Their meals were left at the door. The candles burned lower. Voices spoke only through curtain folds. And yet someone always came. A child with broth, a maid with a hymn, a hand, gloved and gentle, smoothing the pillow. Even in fear, kindness flickered. Sometimes the chapel bell rang. Not for mass, not for feast, but slowly, once, twice, for the soul just passed. The castle paused. The Lord lowered his gaze. The cook crossed herself. The hounds stilled near the hearth. In that moment, the cold outside seemed less sharp than the silence inside. But no one wept loudly. Grief in winter came like snowfall, soft, endless, and seen only in the quiet. And still, most returned. The fever broke, the cough dulled, the color returned to the cheek. And one by one, they rejoined the living. Weaker, slower, but smiling. A seat was reclaimed by the fire. A laugh returned to the hall. The herbs were bundled again, hung to dry. The candles were trimmed, and the sick room, once still as the grave, was swept clean, aired out, and forgotten, until the next time. Winter was a season of counting, of cellars checked by candlelight, of salt barrels tapped with knuckles, of grain sifted for stones and insects. Every crumb mattered, and every shadow in the storeroom meant something might be missing. A castle could have stone walls 10 feet thick, but hunger found its way in, quiet, creeping, and patient. At first, there was plenty. Round loaves pulled from ovens, crust golden, crumb soft. But flour dwindled faster than anyone admitted. Eggs were scarce. Yeast grew sluggish in the cold. So the loaves became flatter, heavier, then darker, until the last pieces resembled stone, sliced thin and soaked in broth to soften. Still, they were eaten with care. Nothing was wasted, not in January. The castle cellar, once loud with bustle, grew quiet. Salted pork hung stiff in the rafters. Dried peas waited in sacks. Pickled onions floated like ghosts in cloudy brine. Each morning, the steward descended with a ledger. He marked the tally. He frowned. He scratched out a line. By February, even he stopped speaking while underground. It was as if the walls themselves were listening. There were still meals, but they grew simpler. Broth, bread crusts, and once prized scraps, liver, turnip tops, stale beer. The Lord ate the same as his servants. He did not speak of hunger, but his belt drew tighter. And when guests arrived unexpectedly, the steward's eye twitched, not out of rudeness, but out of math. There would be enough. There had to be enough. In secret, some hoarded. A maid kept a single carrot beneath her cot. A page tucked away dried cherries in a hollow tile. A cook wept when she spilled a pot of barley, not for the mess, but for the waste. No one stole, but everyone held back just a little. Winter taught that silence could feed a person longer than pride. And then, one day, a sprout appeared in the garden box by the window. Green, small, fragile. The cook smiled. The steward chuckled. A child clapped. It wasn't a feast, not even a meal, but it was spring's first whisper. And in a castle that had grown used to echoes, it felt like a psalm. It came suddenly, a storm in the night, snow against the shutters, drifts high against the walls by dawn. The roads disappeared, the paths vanished, and with them the world outside. The castle stood wrapped in white, not a fortress, but a forgotten island. A first sign was the silence. No creaking of carts, no hoofbeats on the bridge, no messenger hunched in a cloak, stomping snow from his boots. Just wind. The steward checked the gate. The stable boy peered down the valley. Nothing. The world was gone beneath a soft blanket, not cruel, just endless. And the castle waited. The guards no longer watched for invaders. They watched the sky. Their posts were silent. Breath steamed from beneath fur hoods. Arrows were pointless now. The enemy was not a knight, but the cold. Some stood only for duty. others for distraction, but all stared at the white hills beyond the moat, wondering if spring remembered the way back. In the chamber, letters piled up, one for a cousin in the south, one to a nearby manor, one to the abbey, each sealed in wax, each waiting for a rider. But no rider would come, not now. And so the words waited, like seeds in frozen soil, their meaning still alive, but unmoving for now. By week's end, people began to whisper. Would help come? Would the stores last? Would the snow melt too fast, flooding the fields? Some asked silently, others aloud, behind their hands. The lady of the house walked the corridors more often, smiling softly, placing her palm on shoulders, offering warm wine. She did not promise anything, but she reminded them they were still together. Then, one morning, the guard called from the tower, a figure on the slope, a horse, a banner. Not a large party, just one, cloaked, hooded, riding slow, hoofprints vanishing behind them. A messenger. The gates groaned open, the steward ran, the cook dropped a ladle. The world was returning, and the castle, snowbound, silent, still breathing, whispered thanks without words. Even castles were not invincible. Stone cracked, wood shrank, iron rusted. In the deepest chill, a fortress became fragile, groaning beneath snow-laden roofs and frozen ground. The castle did. It whispered through beams. It sighed through corridors. It shed pieces like leaves. It too was simply trying to survive the season. In the upper halls, where wind pressed hard against the gables, old oak beams began to moan. The sound came at night, a slow creak, then a sudden pop, like ice splitting on a frozen pond. The carpenter was called. He tapped the wood, pressed an ear to the grain. Too wet, he muttered. Too dry, too long without sun. The beam held, but everyone walked softer beneath it. Below, the frost pushed up from the earth. The floor of the cellar shifted. A crack traced through the mortar like a vine. Barrels tipped. A shelf leaned. The steward frowned and lit more candles. He did not panic. He placed straw in the gap and said a prayer. In winter, faith held up as much as architecture. It was the fourth step from the top. A guard pressed his boot too firmly, and the stone snapped. Not loudly, but enough to make him stumble. No one was hurt, but the masons were summoned. The stair was blocked. A warning was carved into the wall, soft in frost. The tower had stood for 100 winters. It would likely stand 100 more. But still, they repaired the step, just in case. In the chapel, water dripped from the ceiling. The snow above had melted a little, then frozen again. The lead tiles shifted. A crack formed, and now, each morning, a drop fell into a wooden bowl placed by the priest. Plink, plink, plink. He listened as he prayed. The sound was not unpleasant, just steady. Even the roof, it seemed, had something to say. It was easy to think of castles as permanent, but in winter they revealed their age, their wounds, their weaknesses, their quiet needs. And those who lived within did not scorn them for it. They patched the walls, braced the beams, whispered thanks to stone that still stood, because the castle had endured like they had. Nigh perfectly, but enough. There was a moment in every long winter when the stillness changed. Each morning felt like the last. Gray sky, cold hearth, the same wool tunic, the same thin gruel, the same footsteps echoing in the same halls. Time dulled. The steward stopped counting days. The servants stopped mentioning dates. Even the bells in the chapel rang slower, as though tired. And yet, everyone rose. Everyone worked. Because habit was hope in disguise. Not into fear, not into urgency, but into a quiet ache. For sunlight, for sound, for the feel of grass beneath bare feet. It did not announce itself. It simply settled, like dust, like the final snow. And the people in the castle endured, not just the frost in the air, but the one in the spirit. People found places to sit near windows, not for warmth, but for distance. A maid stared at the snow, blinking slowly. A knight carved shapes into the frost with a gloved finger. A child counted the icicles until she fell asleep. The outside world was unreachable, but it was still there. And that reminder, quiet as it was, kept them tethered. They began to speak of spring, not eagerly, just softly, in stories, in half-remembered songs. Someone recalled the taste of berries. Another, the sound of frogs in the moat. A boy asked if bees remembered how to return. These weren't complaints. They were offerings, like flowers placed on a windowsill in hope, not expectation. For the lord of the castle, the lady of the keep, the oldest steward, the youngest maid, it was the same. A sense of holding one's breath, not from fear, but from waiting too long. The cold was not cruel, just endless. And weariness became the true adversary. Not snow, not wind, but the silence inside one's chest. And then it shifted. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but gradually. The snow softened, the air lost its edge. A single drop of water ran down the outer wall like a tear. Someone opened a window. It creaked, stiff from disuse. But it opened. And in that breath of slightly warmer air, the castle, and everyone in it, remembered. Winter was not forever. And so, the long winter draws to a close. The snow melts in silence, slipping from towers and tiles. The castle exhales, tired but intact. Within its walls, the stories of struggle and stillness have been quietly laid to rest. The cough behind the curtain, the thin broth shared in silence, the flicker of hope in a frostbitten hall, all of it now belongs to memory. No one in the castle shouted. No one begged for spring. They simply endured, like stone in the wind, like a candle in the cold, one quiet day at a time. And here, with the final pages turned, the halls fall silent once again. Outside your window, perhaps the night is still and deep, or perhaps dawn is just beginning to pale the sky. Wherever you are, dear listener, thank you for staying, for listening, and for wandering through these worn stone corridors and winter rooms. If you're still awake, feel free to leave a soft comment below. Perhaps the time you're watching this, or a moment that gently stayed with you from our long journey. This has been your narrator, warmly guiding you through the frost. Historian Couch signs off.